So I remember the day well. It was It was Wednesday, August the 1st, 2007. Man, I remember that really well, don't I? It was Wednesday, August 1st, 2007. It was a nice day in central Ohio. All of our belongings were gone and packed in a truck heading toward our new home. What remained was stuffed in the back of our Suzuki XL7. The plan for the day looked something like this. First, we were going to give the house one last good cleaning. We didn't want to leave our landlords with a big mess to clean up. Secondly, we were going to say goodbye to our friends from our Sunday school class. This group of people had become really good friends and close to us. As a matter of fact, it was the very first time in ministry where Joy and I had the opportunity to be a part of a class together versus teaching it. Third, that day, we were going to spend one final evening with the students that we had served for over 3.5 years. It was going to be a normal Wednesday night. At the end of it, we were going to have just a small going-away party for us. And then last but not least, we were going to get into the car and drive to Louisville, Kentucky for the night. So after the reception was done that Wednesday night, we loaded up Caleb and Madeline in their car seats, put our dog and cat in their appropriate crates in the back seat, and began to pull out of the driveway of our home. Can I tell you something? That day there was an overload of emotions. We knew what was ahead of us in Texas, but there was this sense of wondering whether or not this was the right move. I think I must have asked this question aloud 100 times to Joy. Are we doing the right thing? Then something happened. One honk. 2 honks. Another honk. A 4th honk. Now, we lived in Springfield, Ohio, and when people honked, you just kept driving to try to ignore the honks, okay? Then we noticed who was doing the honking. It wasn't somebody trying to let their road rage out on us like had done in the past. It was several of our students. You see, they were literally escorting us out of town. They would pull up next to us, honk their horn, yell out a word of encouragement, and then keep driving. And this happened throughout the entire city of Springfield. So finally, as we approached the edge of town, each driver honked one more time, waved goodbye, and turned back to the church where we had started. Now, can I tell you something? This made our emotions go crazy. I was sitting in the driver's seat crying like a baby. Joy was sitting next to me in the passenger seat, sobbing like crazy too. Caleb and Madeline, well, they were kind of zonked out because they had already fallen asleep by the time we got out of town. It was a very touching moment for us. Now, although we knew that this transition was taking place, although we had been planning for this transition for quite some time, and although we really knew that God was in the midst of this move and directing our path, nothing could have prepared us for the loss that we experienced at that moment. You see, we came to realize something that day. We came to realize, first of all, that relationships were no longer going to be the same. We weren't going to relate to those people like we had in the past. We realized that our connections with them were different now. We couldn't just get into a car and go to their house. And Joy and I kept asking the question and wondering if we were doing the right thing. We really felt the loss at that moment. But as we continued to drive toward Louisville, God just overwhelmed us with this incredible sense of peace. This morning, we're talking about grief. And we're going to go out on a limb and guess that most of the time when you think about grief, that death is the next thing that probably comes to your mind. Now, it is true that death causes grief in one's life. Just take a moment to ask some of us who have lost loved ones recently. Each of us will tell you that we're in the process. We're in the process of understanding that grief. But the truth is this, death. Death is only one occurrence that causes grief in one's life. There is a myriad of other situations that bring about grief. Loss of job, loss of property, loss of relationship, just to name a few. The common denominator in all of that is this, loss. You see, when we experience loss in our lives, we experience grief. And grief is just an emotional response that we work through when experiencing loss. Here's the thing. It's going to take some time. And that's okay. Grief is not something to rush quickly through. But how you handle your grief is really important. Your emotional response should be one that is healthy and appropriate. I think that grief brings out the worst in people. There are many times in which people turn to alcohol and drugs when they're dealing with their grief. They use these substances as a soothing mechanism from the pain. The problem with that is this. At some point in time, the soothing wears off, and you have to go back for more in order to cover that pain. Some people turn their grief into extreme anger. Pastor Jim shared a couple weeks ago about a guy named Charles Roberts, who was the perpetrator of the incident in Nichols Mine, Pennsylvania. His actions that day were the results of heavy grief that he'd been carrying for years over the loss of a child. Now, still others become depressed. They do not have any hope. The loss for them is just too much to bear. You know, as followers of Jesus Christ, we should work through our grief differently than the world. We should. Jesus Christ should be the first one that we turn to in our moments of grief. But what else should we do to work through our grief that is countercultural, that is different from the world? The question is this: how should you navigate through the grief that you experience in life? Our passage from today comes from John chapter 11. We're going to look at verses 17 through 41. It's located on pages 1063 and 1064 of the Blue Bible in front of you. And as you're turning there, I want to set up some context for our passage from today. In the first part of John chapter 11, we find out about a guy named Lazarus. Now, there's a few things to know about Lazarus. First of all, he is sick. He is sick. We don't know exactly what his ailment is or how long Lazarus had been dealing with it. All that we know is that Lazarus is sick and the prognosis is not good at all. Whatever the sickness was, it knocked Lazarus down physically quite a bit. The second thing we learn about Lazarus is this. Lazarus has two sisters, Mary and Martha. Now, these two sisters cared greatly for their brother. And like most people who found themselves in the middle of a situation similar to that of Lazarus, Mary and Martha sought out help. They probably called the best doctors in Bethany to come and look at their brother. They probably asked people in their synagogue to be praying for their brother. And they sent out word to Jesus himself about Lazarus and his condition. The third thing we find out in John chapter 11 is that Lazarus and Jesus were friends. They were friends. It wasn't a casual friendship. Lazarus and Jesus knew each other pretty well. It was a solid, loving friendship. As you continue on in John chapter 11, we find out that Jesus gets word about Lazarus' sickness. So Mary and Martha send the word. Jesus receives that word, but he doesn't panic. He doesn't call 911 frantically. Jesus just calmly goes on about his business. It's not that Jesus didn't care about what was going on with Lazarus. Jesus knew what would bring God the most glory and the most recognition in the situation. Yes, absolutely, a miraculous healing would be amazing. But what else could God do because of Lazarus' condition? So Jesus stays put for a couple more days before he and his disciples head toward Bethany. When they finally do, Jesus makes them aware of what he's known all along, that Lazarus was dead. Now, Mary and Martha and those who were close to Lazarus were experiencing grief from his untimely death. So here's the question for us today. As followers of Jesus Christ, how should we work through grief when we experience it in our lives? As followers of Jesus Christ, how should we work through grief when we experience it in our lives? First and foremost, we should associate, don't isolate. Associate, don't isolate. Verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. According to the text, many people had come to Bethany to be with Mary and Martha. Now, we don't know exactly the number of people, but we do know that people had come to show their support. You see, Mary and Martha were hurting. They were hurting at the loss of their brother. But here's the thing, they didn't keep people away. They didn't lock the door to their home and remain in isolation. They didn't withdraw and keep to themselves. Mary and Martha welcomed the company of family and friends. They received their hugs. They listened to their words of encouragement. Mary and Martha hung out with people. Sandy Hummerhouse is one of our friends here at Parkgate Community Church, and she lost her husband just a little over a year ago. At first, Sandy tried to work through the grief that she was experiencing on her own, but she soon found out that didn't help very much at all. Those feelings that she was experiencing, they weren't getting any better. When A.L. Rojas offered a grief class here at Parkgate, Sandy decided to give it a shot. So what she found out really quickly was the people in that group were very helpful to her. She actually began the process to grieve that process a little bit more. She began talking about her feelings. You see, the people in that group helped Sandy to know a couple things. First, that her feelings were valid. What she was going through, what she was experiencing, were valid feelings. And secondly, that those feelings needed to be addressed. So rather than suppressing those feelings down, the group helped Sandy to talk about those experiences and get those feelings out. You see, she found out that she had a safe place. And having that safe place helped Sandy to take some steps toward wholeness. It helped her to have that support, encouragement, and hope. Friends, when you're dealing with grief, you should never do it in isolation. Grief should never be done in isolation. You should surround yourself with folks who love you, will listen to you, will support you, and be there for you. Now, maybe today you're here and you're not dealing with grief in your life right now, but you understand the pain that grief brings with it, okay? If that is you, then what you should be doing is helping others work through the grief that they're experiencing. And the best way to do that is to just be present in their lives. Offer words of encouragement and support. Cook a meal. Watch the kids. Be present. These are just a few of the ways that you can support somebody who is grieving. If you are experiencing grief, here's the thing. Allow your support community to help you. Allow your support community to help you. Associate, don't isolate. As followers of Jesus Christ, how should we work through grief when we experience it in our lives? Secondly is this. Talk amongst yourselves, don't stay silent. Talk amongst yourselves, don't stay silent. Verse 21. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who was to come into the world. And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. Mary and Martha talked about the grief that they were experiencing. Now, although the text doesn't mention it specifically, Mary and Martha surely had conversations with the friends who had come to mourn with them. If Mary and Martha were anything like us today, then they probably shared stories about different times in Lazarus' life, like those funny moments of his life, or maybe those times when Lazarus was an annoying brother, or maybe even those rougher moments of Lazarus' life. They talked about his life in order to work through some of their pain. But Mary and Martha also talked with Jesus. And as the text states, they were really expressive to Jesus about what was going on. They both shared with him the pain of the loss that they were experiencing. Friends, talking helps us to process through the grief. Now, most people would tell you that talking about the grief helped them to realize what they were fully experiencing. It gave that person kind of permission to recognize those feelings by verbalizing them. Bob Dietz, who is author of the book Life After Loss, tells the story about a couple who divorced after 16 years of marriage. When the divorce was final, the husband decided to go and see a counselor. You see, the loss of his marriage was causing some major trauma in his life. So seeing the counselor helped this gentleman to discover a few painful things about himself. He learned that the way he was treating his wife and really his kids really helped contribute to the breakup of his marriage. He soon discovered that talking through those issues helped him to understand who he was and the pain that he was going through. You see, talking helps us to work through our grief. It may take some time, but that's okay. What's important, and what's more important than anything, is working through the grief that you are carrying. It's important to find a few people that can help you be open and honest with you about your feelings, that you can unload everything you have on them. And here's the thing, don't forget to talk to God. I think sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we're struggling with something, we have it easy to talk with people, but sometimes we don't always think about talking to God. And here's the fact of the matter, you need to talk to God. Now, I realize I'm a pastor, and I should encourage you to do that as a pastoral leader in this congregation, but why is it important for you to talk to God? First and foremost, He is the God of all comfort. God desires to comfort you in your loss. Secondly, God is the Father of all compassion. He cares about you and wants to love on you in those moments of grief. Third is this, God is the God of peace. When you are facing moments of grief, you need some peace during the turmoil. So take some time to talk with God. Take some time to talk with God. Share with Him. Let Him know what you are struggling with as you grieve. Be open and honest with Him. God loves you and wants to hear about your pain. You know, as we read in the text, Mary and Martha were very vocal with Jesus about the pain that they were experiencing. Friends, we should be too. Talk amongst yourselves. Don't stay silent. As followers of Jesus Christ, how should we work through the grief when we experience it in our lives? Thirdly is this, let the tears fall, don't choke them back. Let the tears fall, don't choke them back. Verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take the stone away," he said. I love this part of the text. I think this part of the text is awesome. And here's why. Jesus shows his human side. Lazarus was dead. Mary and Martha were beside themselves. Others were mourning. And all of the emotion of that moment comes to the surface, and Jesus cries. He cries. Now, I'm certain that it was not just a few tears running down his face. The text says that Jesus wept, that he was deeply moved, maybe even sobbing, maybe even to the point of being inconsolable at the moment. I would imagine that his crying was very, very visible to those who were there that day. Jesus was moved to tears. He was upset about the death of his friend. Now, fellas, those of us in the room, we've been told all of our lives that men are not supposed to cry, correct? We're supposed to be tough kind of guys. Crying's a sign of weakness. Men are supposed to be strong in every situation, even if it means holding back tears of grief. Guess what? That could not be further from the truth. It is absolutely, positively okay to cry. In fact, it's something that all of us, every person, needs to do in moments of grief. Here's why. Crying is one of the healthiest things you can do. Studies have shown that tears of sadness have a different chemical makeup than tears of joy. They release these substances that have a calming effect. See, crying helps us to feel better and actually begins the process of recovery in our lives. It's good to cry. You may recall that my oldest brother passed away back in March. And the morning after he died was a little rough for me. The reality of his passing was a little unsettling to me. But as we do every Sunday morning, my family loaded up in the car and came on to church, just as usual. Before learning hour that morning, my emotions were really raw, and our student ministry was praying around me just for some comfort, and I began to cry a little bit then. I even shared with them the importance of crying and letting it all out. But as the morning went on, I tried to just kind of hold my own and do well as a leader. Things were going good. Got to second service. Things were going fine, singing songs to Jesus. I was good. Leading my different parts of the service. I did all right until it came to the communion invitation. Now, one would think that just inviting people to come and get the elements was not a big deal, right? But for some reason, for me that day, it was. And I remember standing right about here that morning and giving my communion invitation, and then all of a sudden, I just could not hold it any longer. All of a sudden, the tears just started to flow, and I couldn't control them. I had lost it. I was inconsolable. I remember trying to get something together, but I'm looking at Kenneth, shaking my head no, and walking calmly over by Joy at the piano and just sitting there sobbing. What I learned a couple of days after that, through some of your words, man, I'm doing so good. I learned through some of your words that it was okay as a leader that day to be up here letting it loose. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to cry in front of you. I wanted to be strong. I couldn't, just like I can't now. But you know what? I was so blessed by your words that gave me permission, to just let that go. And I've been reminded time and time again that it's okay for me to just have a good cry. It's okay to do that. It's okay to have a cry and get on that road of recovery, and maybe have another cry as you continue down that road of recovery until you are completely whole. So friends, let the tears fall. Don't choke them back. Associate, don't isolate. Talk amongst yourselves. Don't stay silent. Let the tears fall. Don't choke them back. If you're to read on in the continuation of John chapter 11, you will find that Jesus is at the tomb of Lazarus, and he tells them to roll the stone away. And he calls Lazarus out of the tomb, and Lazarus comes out, a dead man walking, newly alive. And Jesus tells them, unwrap him from the burial clothes. He is alive. But I want to go back to verse 25 for just a moment. In verse 25, as we close, Jesus says this, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus, with that statement, makes a powerful proclamation. He lets it be known that he is the resurrection and the life. And with that moment, with that statement, Jesus brings hope. He brings hope to Mary and Martha in this dire situation. And those ladies receive that hope and embrace that hope. Friends, as followers of Jesus Christ, when we experience moments of grief, and can I tell you something? You will experience moments of grief in your life. We must hold firmly to the hope of Jesus Christ. We must hold firmly to this man that we pledge our lives to, because Jesus is our hope. In the beginning of our grief, Jesus is our hope. In the middle of our grief, Jesus is our hope. After we have worked through our grief, Jesus is our hope. Friends, Jesus is our hope. And here's the thing. It's that hope that empowers us as we work through the grief that we're experiencing that will come our way. How do I know that? Because that hope's what's at work in me. How do I know that? Because that hope is what's at work in Frankie Duenas right now. How do I know that? Because I've heard your stories about loss in your life where you've told me it's only because of Jesus that I'm in this place or I'm at this spot in my life right now. Jesus is our hope. So, are you experiencing grief today? Stay close to your friends and family. Are you experiencing grief today? Talk it out with a friend. Talk it out with a counselor. Go to a support group. Talk it out. Are you experiencing grief today? I'm giving you permission. Give yourself permission to do this too. Have a good cry. But above all, keep your hope firmly planted in Jesus Christ. Now, I'm guessing that there are some of you today who are somewhere in this continuum of grief. Maybe you are at the beginning of it because you just are experiencing a loss. Or maybe you've come through it and things are real kosher. They're real good right now. I want to give you the opportunity to respond. We're going to ask our prayer partners to come forward. And they're just here to support you and wherever you are right now in your grief. Because you know what? We need each other as we experience these moments in our life too. We're going to sing a song, God of Miracles. And you know what? I believe wholeheartedly that God wants to perform a miracle in your life as you work through this grief. Because he doesn't want you to stay in the same place that you have been. He wants you to work through it so that you can be whole, so that you can walk alongside those other folks who are doing the same thing. So during this next song, if something's resonating with you today, if God's prompting you, would you move forward? Would you just move forward and ask for these folks just to prayerfully support you wherever that may be? Stand and respond as we sing.